All right, hey guys. So today I'm going to explain the differences between these OBS FORD F150s with the 5.0s. These vary wildly from like 92 to 93 and then 94 onward. There's quite a bit of changes, and you never really know just by looking at these engines. But, well, first of all, the main obvious one. This is a 92. I have a 94. I'll show you. These trucks do not have a mass airflow sensor. These are, as you can see, MAP sensor controlled. Now, 94 and up, these were mass airflow sensors. That's just one of the major changes everyone knows about, but there's also several small ones. For example, this truck's been updated, but this 92 came with a different style alternator than this. It came with one of the 2G alternator that has the fan on the outside. And those are actually known fire hazards because of their connectors. So if you have one of these older ones that has that style, I recommend doing the swap. There's more detailed guides online, but as you can see, I did it and it works fine. Also, these trucks air charge sensors. I'm not sure if you can see that, but they go right there on the intake manifold. And as I'll show you in a bit here on the 94, that is not the case. On the 94, it goes into the airbox here. Also, how they did the PCV valves were different on this generation. From the 92, the PCV valve on all these trucks, it's underneath the valve cover or the intake manifold here. But on this truck, it routes directly to the back of this intake manifold right in there. And that's actually a problem because it's known for flooding the number 8 cylinder with oil and giving it an uneven burn, which over time can cause the number 8 cylinder to drop a hole in it. And yeah, Ford never released a service bulletin on this, but they did mention that if you have one of these that has it in the back like this one is, you should remove it from the back, plug that, and then run it to your vacuum tree here. And that'll prevent anything bad from happening. Okay, up here on my 1994, and you can see that this is very different. Instead of just having 2 hoses that go all the way to the airbox, it goes into one, and that way they could use the mass airflow sensor here. Also, you can see where the air charge sensor would be on the 92, it is not here. Because in this truck, they put it, where is it? Put it right here into the airbox, and that is for the mass airflow trucks. Now, another major difference on these trucks is right here. Now on 92 and I believe 93. Now if you have a 93, I'd do some further research because they're kind of a crossover year, so it's a bit confusing. They may or may not have this style or the old style. But the 92s for sure have an older vacuum actuated cruise control system. So this plug is not here, and this is empty on the brake master cylinder, which I'll go back and show you on the 92 later. And instead, they just have a cruise control module here and a hose that runs to the vacuum tree. But on the 94 here, you can see that it is a plug, and these are actually a problem. These are known fire hazards because of this plug. These trucks can burn down, and they were pretty bad. Ford released a recall, pretty massive one in the 2000s. This also affects the 10th gen F-150s too, believe it or not. So make sure that you have this blue tag here if you have this here. And if you don't, please take it to Ford. They will probably honor the recall, or go to eBay and buy the fusible link harness for like 15 bucks. That's exactly what this is. This little blue tag is adding a harness that adds a non-serviceable fuse. That way your truck doesn't burn down. And take note that your truck could burn down in the middle of the night, completely shut off due to this. So as long as the battery's plugged in, that could be a problem. So keep that in mind. You see the new gen alternator here. This is the one you should have, the 3G. Back over here to the 92, and you can see that there's no provision here and there's no plug. I removed the cruise control stuff. You can see the old plug there, but it used to just be a vacuum line, a big thing that had a vacuum line that would go to that tree, and obviously no electronics because it was entirely vacuum actuated. And this one isn't a problem. Those cruise control systems are fine. They're not known fire hazards. So if you have nothing here, don't worry about it. Another change that I believe happened around 94 was the firing order changed. Now on these 92 and I believe 93 302s, the firing order is 1, 5, 4, 2, 6, 3, 7, 8, like it's always been for the 302s. However, in 94, they changed it to 1, 3, 7, 2, 6, 5, 4, 8, which is the same firing order, I believe, as the 351 Windsor and the other 302 high outputs. So don't get that mixed up, because you can cause a crossfire that can really fuck some shit up. Now, this isn't really a difference between these engines whatsoever, but this is something that Ford changed. So when these trucks were released, 92s, 93s, 94s, etc., but these 302s, these were originally from the factory. You were supposed to run 5W30 conventional oil in it. Now, I think sometime in the late 90s, don't quote me on the time period, but Ford changed it. They put out a service bulletin saying that, no, in fact, you should run 520 in these engines. I wouldn't recommend doing that. I'd stick with 530. That's just way too thin of oil for these engines. I mean, on some of these, particularly this one that's really clapped out with lots of blow-by, actually, I run 1540 diesel oil in the summer, and that seems to help it quite a bit. My 94 is less clapped out, so I just run generic 530 there, and it seems to be just fine. This one isn't a change per se, but take note, if you're ever trying to diagnose a coolant temperature issue or something like that with your engine, there is 2 coolant temperature sensors in these engines. There's one that sends the reading to your gauge, which is the one that you read, but there's also one that sends the reading to your ECU. So if your engine's acting funny, there's a chance that even though you can see the proper temperature, your ECU can't. Or if you're replacing one, it might be a good idea to replace the other. Or sometimes when you're buying one, you can get confused and buy the wrong one. So keep that in mind. Another thing of note is actually the speedometer and the gauge cluster, believe it or not. So if you ever have a speedometer die in these trucks, you might figure out that it's the PSOM unit, which is the programmable speedometer odometer module. And that's responsible for not only reading showing you your speed and your odometer readings, but it's also responsible for telling the transmission that. So if your odometer or your speedometer goes, your transmission will start flashing the overdrive light and shifting funny because it'll be in limp hone mode. Now, before you go and just swap out a random cluster, there's the thing. Ford, for whatever reason, made these gauges completely different, even though they all look the same. For example, this 92 cluster, even though it looks identical to the one in the 94, is not plug and play. They actually completely changed the pin out on these things. So only 92 and 93 is compatible, 94 and 95 is compatible, and I believe 96 and 97 is compatible. However, if you're willing to dig deeper and pull the actual PSOM individual speedometer unit out by itself, they're all interchangeable across all years, but you can't just swap the gauge cluster in, so keep that in mind. This one's more just a helpful trick than anything. If you ever want to delete your EGR system or delete your EGR valve, a lot of guys will just, unplug that and call it good. You're not actually doing it right then, because your computer is still adjusting things for the EGR even though it's not there. The proper way to do it is obviously to remove that module, put a block off plate there with a gasket, but you also need to buy a plug on eBay that plugs into this end and tricks the computer into thinking that it has an EGR, but it's always shut off. And that way the computer won't adjust anything for the engine, and it also won't give you a check engine light. I believe there is a way that you can make that yourself without having to buy a connector, by getting an XLR audio connector and then forming it with 3 different types of resistors. I don't remember the values off my hand or off the head, but yeah, you can fake the same plug with some sort of resistors. There's definitely info on that online. Also, if your truck is ever having a surging idle when it's cold, it's probably right there. It's probably your IAC sensor, so replace that. Another thing to note, if you're having a crank but no start issue, there is a chance that it could be due to that ignition module right there on the driver's side firewall. Mine have gone bad a few times. And make sure when you install these that you install these properly. They come with a little pack of thermal paste inside, and make sure you put that between the plastic sensor and that metal heatsink, because the #1 cause of these things dying is heat. Actually, funny enough, back on the older F150s with these 302s, back on the brick nose generation, the ignition module was actually right on the distributor, and you can still see the provision right there with the 2 screw holes where it bolted up. Now, the problem with these is these died frequently due to heat, and I actually remember having a brick nose and having to replace that constantly. So later in this generation, Ford put it over there to help better dissipate the heat with a much bigger heatsink attached to the fender. So please use the thermal paste, otherwise you will fry it. These things are not not cheap to replace. Now, this last thing here isn't necessarily 302 or even F150 specific, but if you ever notice that your cruise control is no longer working, your airbag light is flashing, and your horn doesn't work, then chances are it's probably the clock spring in your steering wheel's dead. But yeah, thank you guys for watching. Hope that you found some useful information here about your truck, or anything that could help you out. So thanks.